Hi, Peter Dorman again with a lecture on how it can be that economists believe, or most economists believe, they have a scientific basis for determining what public policies to recommend or oppose. In technical terms, this is about the normative analysis of markets. To make sense of this, we begin with the distinction between positive and normative analysis. Positive analysis is the analysis of what is, what was, or what will be. In other words, it's description, explanation, or prediction. It, in theory, could be shown to be true or false based on what actually occurred, what evidence you have. So in some sense, it presents itself as being scientific. Normative analysis is about values, or what should be. So typically, it's about questions like, is one policy or idea or outcome better than another? Or is this particular idea the best we can do, or is there something else that's better than it? So it's about better or worse, or deciding which option should be selected. You would think that, that there'd be a wall between the two, and that the kinds of methods you use for positive analysis would not be very applicable for normative analysis. Now, while it's true that there is a wall in some sense between the concepts, it's also true that there's overlap between them. Nevertheless, what's really interesting about what we're going to look at today is how economists try to take the same analysis that they do for asking questions of how do we explain what happened or how do we predict what will happen, and use that analysis to make value judgments about what should happen. So let's look first of all quickly, this is all a recap, of the positive analysis of markets. So the initial starting point in theory is supply and analysis, and in empirical practice it's elasticity. A predictive economic model has a system of equations, and it uses actual data or collected data to fit those equations to experience, and then on the basis of that you can use the models to explain or predict the kinds of outcomes that you see in the real world. An example, one question that's been looked at by economists is, what was the effect of railroads on 19th century agriculture? What difference did it make that we had a policy in the US to promote railroads instead of, say, canals? And so you can have a complicated economic model of the effect of transportation costs on agricultural markets and do some analysis of this. That would be an attempt to explain the development of agriculture in the 19th century. Another one is, what would be the effect of a soda tax on the consumption of sodas by people in a society, especially teenagers who are susceptible at a young age to develop lifelong habits of soda drinking? Would a soda tax have a big effect, a small effect, no effect? That's a question of prediction. And again, economists have models that they can try to fit to the data and make a prediction of, if you put a 20-cent a bottle tax on a soda, what effect will that have on consumption? Normative analysis, on the other hand, is about what should happen. And in order to conduct normative analysis, you need a number of assumptions that pertain to what should means. So part of the assumptions you need are positive, that is what you think will happen, so you can judge what you want to happen, but then you need additional assumptions that pertain specifically to what you think ought to happen or what is desirable. That means specifically you have to have a definition of what best means. What does it mean for something to be best? And you have to have assumptions about how markets work in relationship to what's best. In other words, do markets typically produce the best outcome or not the best outcome, or under what circumstances? If you have all of these assumptions in place, you might be able, if you're an economist, to apply the results of a positive analysis of markets to a normative question of what should be done. So going from, for instance, a prediction of how a soda tax would affect soda consumption to a judgment of whether that tax is a good thing or a bad thing, if the size of the tax is the right amount, details like this. Here's how it works. Recall that we have a supply and demand model in economics with supply curves and demand curves, price on the vertical axis, the quantity produced and consumed on the horizontal axis. These curves, in theory, could be estimated. Actually, only elasticities can be estimated, but if you're willing to swallow some further assumptions, you can pull those elasticities into the direction of entire supply and demand curves. And then on the basis of this, you can do a positive analysis. You can ask, what would be the market equilibrium that we would predict would arise from such supply and demand curves? Now, think about how this would look if instead of supply and demand curves, you had cost curves and benefit curves, where the cost curves represented the costs to society of providing something, and the benefit curve represented the benefits to society of providing that something. If you could do that, you could have an analysis about what should be done, what would be best for society, what would produce the most benefits or the least costs. In this particular case, you would want to have the biggest possible surplus, I would suppose, of benefits over costs. And if you were able to make the transition from the previous diagram to this one, the equilibrium where the curves cross would be the quote-unquote optimal outcome where the total benefits exceed total costs by the largest extent. We'll see in a moment how that proceeds. So remember from an earlier lecture the concepts of economic benefits and costs. Benefits are assumed to derive only from consumption. There are no other benefits in the economy according to the standard economic approach, and the measurement of those benefits is the consumer's willingness to pay. This becomes the basis for making a normative interpretation of the demand curve, because if the demand curve represents what consumers are willing to pay, then the demand curve represents the benefits to society from that particular good. Costs are assumed to derive from production. Now, those costs, as they're experienced, can take the form of either opportunity costs or disutility costs. In either case, in a normal market, the expectation would be you have to pay people to bear those costs in order to produce something. You have to pay workers to work. You have to pay resource owners to supply resources to a particular production process. And therefore, the prices that you have to pay for all of those components of production constitute the cost to society of that production, the opportunity and disutility costs. So in theory, you get both a supply curve and demand curve that might, if you can swallow all these assumptions, represent social benefits and social costs. But let's be a little bit more precise. Let's talk about marginal benefits and marginal costs. The word marginal is a tricky word because in everyday language, we often use it to mean something that's unimportant or small or that we can afford to overlook. That's just a marginal thing. I don't care about it. But in economics, it doesn't mean that. It doesn't put anything down. It just says incremental. Marginal means additional or incremental. So an additional benefit or an additional cost of doing a little bit more or less of something. A marginal benefit is the additional benefit that comes from a little bit more of additional consumption, and marginal cost is the additional cost that comes from a little bit more production of something. These concepts are important because we're going to bring the analysis down to a single transaction. Instead of looking at the whole market as one giant blob, we're going to come down to a specific transaction, a specific case of somebody buying something from somebody else. In that case, we're talking about marginal, the additional cost or benefit of one more transaction. So the name that I'm going to give for the analysis you're about to see is the market welfare model. I caution you that this is my own terminology. You won't see this anywhere else but in my own presentation of it, but it needs a name. Most economists simply assume it. They've never really analyzed it or considered what the assumptions are, so they don't have a name for it. Since I want to examine it, I need to call it something. I'm calling it the market welfare model. The model works like this. There are three conditions that need to be fulfilled for the model to apply. The first is that the demand curve represents the marginal benefits to society of a good in question. The second is that the supply curve represents the marginal costs to society of the good in question. And the third is that there is a single equilibrium curve crossing supply and demand model, which in fact applies to the situation. And it can be shown, if you make those three assumptions or accept those three conditions, that the market equilibrium, the point at which the curves cross, also is the point at which the net benefits to society for production of that and consumption of that good can be maximized. If you believe that net benefit, benefits minus cost, is the goal of economic life, then you've answered the normative question. You've said, this is the best we can do. If you can accept all of this, you have also achieved a remarkable result within economics, which is that the same analysis you use to make an explanation or a prediction, the supply and demand analysis, can simultaneously be used to make a judgment about what ought to be done. And to the extent that you can claim that you have a scientific basis for making predictions or explanations, you could also say then, it's the same model, we have a scientific basis for making value judgments. It's an extraordinary claim on the part of economics and leads, I think, to a lot of the reason why economics is consulted so frequently in policy analysis. But I have to say, emphasize, the model is conditional. It only works if you can accept those underlying assumptions. To understand this intuitively, it helps to review the concept that we covered earlier of the market as a cost-benefit machine. So you can think of consumers as wanting more goods. They want to acquire things, they want to get benefits from that, but it costs society more in costs to provide those things, and therefore the economic question is how much should be made available to consumers of which types of goods and what types of ways and how they should be produced and who should consume them and so on in order to get the most benefit for the least cost. And that raises the question, how can we know for any particular item whether the benefit for that item is greater than the cost of that particular item? And how can we also know that there are no goods which are being produced for which the cost is greater than the benefit of supplying that good? So in order to answer those questions, we make some further assumptions about buyers and sellers. Those further assumptions are, let's assume that no buyer would ever make a purchase unless the marginal benefit, the additional benefit they get from that one unit that they're buying, is equal to or greater than the price that they have to pay. In other words, they would never buy something if the price meant more to them than the benefit they could get from the good. And assume also that nobody would sell that good unless the price more than covers the marginal cost of producing the good. And if those two things are true, since there is only a single price, the price for the buyer is the same as the price for the seller, it has to be true that marginal benefit is greater than or equal to marginal cost. So this means that a voluntary transaction chosen by a buyer and a seller, according to this logic, would always be one which passes a benefit cost test. It would answer that first question. How do we know if the goods which are bought and sold have benefits that exceed their costs? Well, if you make these assumptions about the buyers and the sellers, you have an answer to that. And as for the second question, how do you know if all the potential transactions where this would happen would occur? Well, the answer is if the information is out there and people know what's available, they know their benefits, they know how much it's going to cost them, or if they're producers, they know how much it costs them and know what the market price is. In such a world where the information is freely available, you would expect all such transactions to occur. And of course, no transaction would occur voluntarily for which the cost was greater than the benefit. So, if you believe all of this, if you believe that the demand curve represents the marginal benefits to society and the supply curve represents the marginal costs, the markets solve everything. We can see this graphically. Look at a diagram of a market where we are simultaneously looking at it positively and normatively. That is, on the positive side, we have a demand curve and we have a supply curve. And on the normative side, we have a marginal benefit curve and a marginal cost curve, where the marginal benefit curve is believed to be the demand curve and the marginal cost curve is believed to be the supply curve. In that case, we can consider various transactions that might occur. So consider a single transaction at Q1. Q1 might be the 1/10,000th transaction. You know, it's like the 10,000th time somebody decided to buy something. It's sitting there on the diagram at a particular point, and for that particular transaction, Q1, to find out the benefit, we go up to the blue line or purple, and to find the cost, we go up to the green line, and clearly the purple line is above the green line. So there's a benefit to that transaction. The benefit to the buyer is greater than the cost to the seller, or in other words, the demand curve is vertically above the supply curve. Now you can imagine another transaction at point Q2, further along the quantity axis. So now we're really going to a high level of quantity where a lot is being bought and sold, and we're looking at one more transaction. And for that transaction, the supply curve is above the demand curve. So the costs, according to these assumptions, are greater than the benefits. That transaction will not occur voluntarily. It will not be undertaken by buyers and sellers. There's no price that they would agree to for such a transaction. The highest price the buyer is willing to pay is below the lowest cost the producer is willing to accept. So it won't occur. That is an example of a transaction that does not pass a cost-benefit test and doesn't occur in the market. And then finally, we can consider a special transaction, Q3, which is just the last transaction in quantity terms. If you're going from left to right, it's the final transaction that would be made where the willingness to pay of consumers is exactly equal now to the cost of producers. That's the last transaction that people would accept. And at that one, the marginal benefit and the marginal cost are equal. And furthermore, they're equal at P star, the equilibrium price. The equilibrium price is equal to the height of the demand curve and the height of the supply curve at Q3. So those pieces of information tell us two things of great importance. The first thing they say is that net benefits are maximized at the particular quantity Q star. That's represented in the diagram by the shaded area to the left of Q star. That area is below the demand curve, so it includes all the benefits, but it's above the cost curve, so it's net of all the costs. That triangle represents net benefits to society. Clearly at Q star, you have all the potential transactions that produce such benefits, net benefits, and none of the ones that don't, so you've maximized it at that point, and that's the equilibrium point. Cool! The market equilibrium, according to this analysis, maximizes the net benefits society gets from that good, whether that good is soda or cars or TV sets or whatever it might be. The second property is an information property, which is that P star, the equilibrium price, also tells you the marginal benefit and the marginal cost of the last unit produced of that good. So it's telling you something about the benefits and costs to society of producing a little bit more or a little bit less of that thing. A further bit of information, the concept of net benefits is often split up into two components. On the top, which is below the demand curve but above the price, is the consumer surplus. So those are net benefits to consumers, i.e. benefits to what they're buying over and above the price they have to pay. And then below that line, but above the cost curve, is profit, which represents net benefits to producers. It's prices that they get that are above the costs that they have to pay in order to provide things to the market. So it represents profit to them. Nice. Now, what about goods that aren't produced? Well, a good that isn't produced would have a supply-demand curve something like this, where the supply curve at every quantity is north of the demand curve. If that's what the curves look like, then you're never going to see a transaction because the highest price consumers are willing to pay is less than the lowest price sellers are willing to accept. And if you believe that the supply curve represents marginal cost and the demand curve represents marginal benefit, that's great. That's how it should be. You're saying that for any level of production of that good, there are going to be net costs to society, not net benefits, but net costs. So it shouldn't happen. It would deduct from society's well-being, and so great, a market doesn't produce it, and it shouldn't produce it. What about the question of quantity? We've been talking about quality. We've been talking about quantities up to now, but a quality can be treated as if it were a quantity. That is, there's a cost to producing quality. There's a benefit to it, and people are willing to pay a certain amount. So we can imagine a market in quality within the market in quantity. That is, there might be, for a housing market, to take one example, there's effectively a market in location, like how much are people willing to pay to live in one neighborhood or another. There's a market in square footage, how much are people willing to pay for a bigger house than a smaller house, for various types of features, if it has a hot tub or a patio deck or something. There are different prices that emerge from markets in housing, where the qualities of the house can also be treated effectively like commodities. And that means that quality as well as quantity falls under the framework of this market welfare model. So to sum up the model one more time, there are three conditions. The first condition is the demand curve needs to represent marginal benefits to society. The second is that the cost curve has to represent marginal cost to society. And the third is that we have this nice crisscrossed supply and demand diagram that actually fits the economy, that's the correct model. If these three conditions are met, then we know that the net benefits to society are maximized by the equilibrium that occurs in the market between buyers and sellers, and that also applies to quality issues. Furthermore, we have the informational advantage that we now can say what the marginal benefit and cost of another unit of that good is based on the price. It comes directly out of the geometry that we've just looked at. However, it's conditional on a bunch of assumptions. Why might these assumptions not hold? There is a very large topic in economics called market failure with a number of subtopics: externalities, public goods, monopoly, asymmetric information. We're going to look at these subsequently and see what these terms refer to, but all of them are treated by economics as reasons why markets would fail to adhere to the market welfare model. So they're not saying markets don't work in some sense. They're not saying that there might not be supply and demand and an equilibrium, but what they're saying is that you can't infer judgments about good and bad, better or worse, from those markets because there's a failure in those markets. So it's important to analyze those failures. It could also be the case that the underlying model is problematic, and we'll have more to say about that too. This is, after all, a model about people. It's about people's behavior, and the normative side, benefits and costs, is also about people's experience of what they find benefits them or is costly to them. And those assumptions of how people's feelings and thoughts work can well be wrong. As we'll find out, actually, there's quite a gap between the way psychologists look at human behavior and the way economists do. A second domain of problems in the underlying model has to do with the single equilibrium, happily crossed curves, supply and demand model. That may not fit. And in fact, there are good reasons to think that in general, it doesn't fit. It's a very conditional model, but economic research shows that the conditions are typically not there for it. So it looks good in the textbooks, but doesn't apply very well to the real world. And finally, the entire analysis is couched in terms of social cost and social benefit. But those terms have not really been defined, and maybe they're not even definable. Maybe the very notion that we can look at society from a unitary point of view of social cost and social benefit could be a problem. And so the analysis wouldn't hold. So where do we end up here? The most important thing is to say that economics as a discipline wants to present itself not simply as a positive field of analysis that makes predictions about the future or provides explanations about past events. It wants to be able to say, in addition, that the same analysis that they do to provide those things also gives them the power to make value judgments about what would be a good or a bad policy in the economic realm. The way in which they do that is the market welfare model. The market welfare model, if you accept all the assumptions, translates a positive analysis into a normative analysis. But as we know, there are many situations in which the model doesn't work. And the most important of these for economists are those that they call market failures. So economics becomes the analysis of market failure. To a large extent, that's what economics as a practicing discipline is about. Show me the market failure. Show me where the market isn't working the way we want it to, and let me analyze then what needs to be done in order to correct for the failure of the market to truly represent benefits and costs. In the applied realm, that's largely what economists do. The market welfare model, it should be said, is not hopelessly far off in a lot of situations. There are many circumstances in which we can probably leave decision-making to the tender mercies of the market, just because the assumptions are not too wildly off, or because the consequences of whatever discrepancy there is are really too small to worry much about. So an example would be toothbrushes. People sometimes give, do we really need to have some public policy where we intervene in the toothbrush market? Are toothbrushes too long or too short, or the bristles too hard or too soft, or the colors too green or too red? Well, maybe. Maybe the world would be better off with a different toothbrush. But one could imagine that the market for toothbrushes more or less represents what people are looking for in toothbrushes, and more or less represents the cost of producing them. And to the extent that it doesn't, you don't have to worry about it so much. So maybe it's okay to leave toothbrushes to the market. On the other hand, as we'll see, it's not a good idea to leave global climate change to the market. In fact, the market doesn't even begin to deal with it, and that's a massive area of economic failure. So economics provides a basis for stepping in when the market welfare model doesn't work well. Just to conclude, my personal view, for what it's worth, is that economics should only do positive analysis and leave all the other stuff alone. I don't think that economics really has anything to say about better or worse, right or wrong in any important areas of human life. I think the assumptions that enable economists to make those claims are really not defensible, both in terms of psychology and in terms of what we know about how societies work. And especially, I don't think economics has anything to say about real value. I don't think there's anything I learned in my training about in economics that qualifies me to make any more judgments about what is better or worse than anyone else. If you're interested in real value, you should talk to the experts in it. If you're interested in health, talk to the public health people. If you're interested in the environment, talk to ecologists. If you're interested in human well-being, psychologists, philosophers, and others have much to say about this. There are many people who devote their lives to the study of well-being, of better and worse in many contexts, and I respect their knowledge. I don't think that knowledge exists in economics.